Okay, so in this video I'm going to teach you how to make a very simple joint, and this wooden joint is called a lap joint. So the tools that we're going to use for this, there's quite a selection, but we're going to use a sharp pencil, a bench hook, a marking gauge, although I'm going to show you some alternatives to this, a steel rule, a tri-square and a tenon saw. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is talk about marking out the joint itself. Now, a lap joint basically is just a little bit stronger than a butt joint where two pieces of wood are placed together, but we cut a little L shape out so that it can sit in, and it just increases the surface area of the joint. Now, the first thing we're going to do is measure our wood to find out how big the joint's going to be, and that is 11 millimeters. Okay, so I'm going to place my ruler on the edge of the joint like this, and I'm going to mark a point at 11 millimeters. Now, this is one way of doing it with a ruler like this. The other alternative obviously is to offer the thickness of the wood up like this, ensuring it's right at the edge of the wood like this, and I can actually mark the point here on that, and you can see that that's pretty much on the 11 millimeter mark. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to mark this at 90 degrees going all the way around the outside. So we're going to use this tool, which is a tri-square. Okay, now I put the brass plate of the tri-square and push it flat up against this edge. This is called a datum edge. It's a flat edge that I can work from, and it only works, this tool, if this is a straight flat edge. Okay, it doesn't work with pieces of wood that are probably natural or not cut accurately. So I'm going to line it up with my point here and just mark a single line round at the front there, and this marks off a 90-degree angle. I'm then going to turn the wood round, and I'm going to mark the joint on the side as well, carefully lining it up with the point like this, and I'm going to do the same on the other side like this. Okay, spend a bit of time with this to make sure that the lines do meet up and they're accurate. Now, the lap joint, effectively, if we just drew it on this side, is a shape a bit like this, like an L shape. So I'm going to have to measure about halfway down the piece of wood like this to mark my line going across. Okay, now obviously we could use a ruler and we could kind of mark one point and another point at 5.5 millimeters. Okay, but the tool we're going to use to do this a bit more accurate is this tool here. It's called a marking gauge. Okay, now what I'm going to do with my marking gauge, I unscrew it here, and it allows me to move the little sharpened point there, the little needle, and set that at a distance away from this flattened wooden edge here. And I'm going to try and set that to 5.5 millimeters like that. Quite difficult to see, but just on the ruler there at 5.5 millimeters. And then once I've got it in position, I carefully screw this up, and I'm going to just double check that again to check that is on 5. It's a little bit too close. Just make it a little bit further away. There we go, that's on about 5.5 millimeters, and I tighten this screw up. Now, how this works is we line it up against, using the wooden piece up against the edge that we're going to mark, and we just draw it away from ourselves like this, and you can see it just puts a slight scratched mark in the actual wood here. Okay, I'm going to follow this all the way around the product like this, and it will put that mark onto the surface there. Okay, now if I want, I could obviously go over this in pencil to make it a little bit easier to see, and then I can see where that lap joint is going to be placed. Now, what I strongly advise as well is the bit that we're going to remove, I just put some cross hatches going across here, or some hatched lines like this, and this tells me the piece of waste that I'm going to remove from the thing. So all of those hatched areas there are the bits that I'm going to cut out to make my joint. Okay, and that obviously should allow the other piece of wood to fit nicely in there. Now, the next stage of making this joint obviously is to start cutting this joint out. Okay, so I'm going to use my bench hook here and secure it in the vise, and I'm making sure that my edge, because I'm right-handed, is on this side. Okay, because that's where I'm going to be cutting my joint. Now, I bring my piece of wood up and I use the tenon saw and just line it up with that edge on the bench hook as to where I'm going to cut, and I'm going to push quite firmly with this hand here against the bench hook to secure it, and I'm going to just draw the saw back a couple of times lightly like this, and it just starts to make the mark. Now, I'm then going to start using the saw like this and cutting down to the halfway point of the line. So I'm checking the line at all times to make sure I'm staying on that, and obviously don't want to go too far. So I'm going to go down just to the point where I'm more or less in line with that line. I've got to go a little bit further and also apply a little bit more pressure to the front of the line there to make sure I'm getting down to that mark. I'm trying to keep the saw level. The other key tip is to point the finger here with the tenon saw as you're cutting the joint to make sure the line goes straight. So I keep doing this like this, using the whole length of the saw until I get down to the edge just there. Okay, now the other stage, we could, for example, get a chisel and use a chisel to chip out this section, but because you know, you're probably doing this for the first time, we're going to use the vise, we're going to turn the piece of wood round, and we're going to cut down the joint as well to cut it out with a tenon saw. So I release the bench or hook from the vise and then tighten up the vise again. So I'm looking at cutting down. Now this time I'm going to put my thumb near the area I'm going to cut to align the saw up with that line, and again I'm just going to draw it back a few times very carefully like this, being careful not to cut my thumb. Okay, and once more I'm using the full length of the saw to cut this joint. I need to make sure it's very secure in the vise, and I'm using the full length of the saw like this to cut down, and I should, if I follow my lines, be able to take that section out and remove that section. I'm always checking that the saw is cutting at 90 degrees and it's cutting front and back equally, and I'm obviously not going over my lines to ensure I remove that piece of work very carefully. So I'm just checking this again, it's getting very close to the section. I need to apply a little bit more force to the front, and you can see we've taken that section out. Now these small little sections here, you can see where I've left a tiny little bit of material, can be cleaned up with a chisel or perhaps with a file, but we should find now that that fits that joint quite accurately. I've got to take that tiny little piece out there, as I say, with a chisel or a file, but that will make a nice tight joint, and we can secure it with PVA or wood glue.